right, now up next to give a market overview and analysis of what's happening in the HPC world is Addison Snell from Intersect360. Addison, how are you doing today?
Hey, Brian, thanks very much for having me. I always love to participate in the HPCAI Advisory Council. I loved how much we were talking about HPC as it relates to COVID-19 in the talks today, and some of the presentations yesterday in particular were just fascinating in terms of modeling the molecules, and we saw that earlier today, and modeling the climate impact. So I thought it'd be appropriate to look at not only HPC versus COVID-19, but COVID-19 versus HPC, because a big thing that we've done as analysts in this community is model the effect on our own industry of COVID-19. There are parts of it, of course, that have been up because HPC gets deployed in the battle against COVID-19 in terms of finding treatments or vaccines or modeling the molecules of it. There are also other major industries that are suffering as a result of COVID-19. If you look at what goes on in energy and transportation and automotive and aerospace, these are suffering markets right now. So we've taken a look at that in terms of our own market model and forecast. It's kind of amazing that it's been now a year since we went to shelter in place here in California, a year and maybe a couple of days. I'd say something glib about that, except it's really been kind of a tragedy all along, and I want to keep focus on that it's not something to make light of, that this has really dramatically impacted a lot of people's lives, and in many ways tragically, and hopefully starting to get ahead of the curve a little bit now. When we went into shelter in place, that was issued as a 2-week order. We were now a couple days into what was intended to be 2 weeks of shelter in place, and here we are a year later having another virtual Stanford conference. It's been quite a year in terms of trying to predict what would happen next, but it's been more of a one day at a time kind of situation. We have had one big announcement from us just recently, in case you missed it. Dan Olds, who many of you are already familiar with through the Student Cluster Competition and the HPC Advisory Council. I believe he's on the call right now. He's joined us as our Chief Research Officer. That's the title previously held by our co-founder, Chris Willard, who retired not long ago. I am thrilled to have Dan on the team. He's been an industry analyst in this space for quite a long time. In fact, he's already been helping us behind the scenes. It turns out I haven't been doing all of this work by myself for the last year, and Dan is among the people who's really been helpful behind the scenes, and really thrilled to get him as a permanent addition to the team now. We like to talk about someone being a triple threat. For an analyst, that'd be someone who can work the data, do the analysis, who can write, and is a good presenter. And Dan can certainly do all of those things, but Dan is really more of in baseball. Sometimes you hear the term a 5-tool player. He brings not only those 3 tools, but he's really entrenched in business strategy, has a business background, which helps not only our own small company, but in particular helps our clients with the insights that he brings to the table. And the thing I really love that I made brief reference to is my entire time in this industry, people have talked about what we need to do to help bring about the next generation of talent in this space. And Dan has been actively doing that with his promotion and role in coordination of the student cluster competitions worldwide. So just thrilled to have Dan on the team, and I'll be leveraging some of his work and insights from our most recent HPC technology survey in this talk. So welcome, Dan, to the team. We've had lots of talks already on supercomputing combating COVID-19, and I can't possibly give a complete overview of all of those here. I will point people to our media partner, HPC Wire. They've put up a story, the history of supercomputing versus COVID-19 for this, as we were saying, 1-year anniversary of a lot of the shutdowns in this country and around the world. That is really a worthwhile retrospective in terms of the different milestones with COVID-19 and the different HPC projects that have had to do with that. I've got a little clip there from This Week in HPC, our weekly podcast. That was actually the second time we covered COVID-19 on the podcast. In the first, about a year ago, I did a podcast together with Carlo Cavazzoni of Cineca, who was essentially reporting from the front lines there. It was just over a year ago, and Italy was the first country in the middle of its shutdown, and Cineca was kind of at ground zero of the European outbreak of COVID-19. I was reporting from Silicon Valley, where we were still a couple days away from schools getting shut down and everything else. And really to get his take, he's a prominent molecular computational chemist, just in terms of where Cineca already was, and things like the Escalate for COVID project that was already starting to launch there was a very big deal. And of course, we've seen the COVID-19 HPC Consortium, all kinds of other projects funded. This is just a small smattering of them in all of the work that's been done over the last year. I think most notably among all of these, I've had this slide up a couple of times, but I want to acknowledge that Fugaku launched early in order to get out the resources to help scientists in this battle. And this is the second time that RIKEN has recently brought out a supercomputer ahead of schedule amidst something big that was happening. The K computer launched early in the wake of the earthquake and tsunami, the major East Japan tsunami several years ago. It was actually 10 years ago now, and they just had a huge aftershock from that same earthquake just a couple of weeks ago. And RIKEN was doing AI modeling for tsunami detection and had just released benchmarks around that very same thing. So a lot of things coming around again, but just acknowledging Fujitsu and RIKEN for the major efforts in not only having the world's most powerful supercomputer and doing it with a new architecture with ARM, but getting it into the hands of scientists early. What a great resource for Japan and for the world in the battle against COVID-19. How this has affected us is, of course, it touched our market forecast. We had already been forecasting the worldwide market to grow to $55 billion worldwide in 2024, which is a 7.1% compound annual growth rate from 2019. And cloud is the major sector growing within that, having a major effect on the market. We're now looking at not only direct spending on cloud, but what we can call cloud-like sorts of environments or deployments that aren't showing up as direct cloud spending. And I can explain that a little further, although I've done that in a different webinar and don't want to derail this one too much. We've edited our budget map survey, which just went into the field yesterday, our annual budget map survey, to try to get a little better granularity about that cloud-like spending going forward. That is a major portion of the forecast going forward. We are looking at the government sector is now driving the primary driver of growth after it's been the commercial segment for many years. Last year, it flipped over to government. The big news, though, is that the COVID-19 pandemic had a dramatic, not just significant, a dramatic effect on HPC market revenue starting last year in 2020 and with ongoing effects in our models through 2023, including some revenue that's lost. We've been monitoring this throughout, and I'm bringing it up again now, not because we have a strict revision to the forecast just yet. You've got to give us several more weeks on that before we have that out, probably in May, but we do do have new survey data in, even ahead of our budget survey that's in the field right now, to help us model the effects of COVID-19 on HPC budgets over the past year. And I'll show what this means here. This is my favorite quote from Chris Willard. And he said this many, many years ago: when you make a forecast, it has to be bound by what's realistic. Reality has no such restriction. And that was never more true than it was last year as we headed into this pandemic. And when we were a year ago in March, it was right around this time that we pre-announced, hang on, there's going to be a change to the forecast coming. And we then gave a range at that point of, instead of the growth in the market, it's going to now be down by 0 to 12%. And then we'll come back around and narrow that forecast down. Then in July, we gave a specific revised forecast for the short-term years based on our modeling of the pandemic. I'll take a look at that model again now and what we think about that going into finalizing 2020 and the near-term year. But let me review first how we looked at that and the shape of a recession. This is now not to do specifically with COVID-19. There's no years on this chart. This is just sort of in general. Put a bar out there, that's year 0, and I'm showing steady market growth with an even growth rate year after year. Let's assume it's just a steady exponential growth of like, I forget what I put on the charts, like 7-8%, something like that. So steady growth year over year. So those blue bars are your pre-recession forecast and growth rate. What happens when there's a recession, a short-term recession in high-performance computing is this. Those blue bars turn into this yellow line. Year 1, the year of the recession, you get a market dip somewhat due to cancellation of purchases, but mostly due to delayed purchases. And we've been showing this slide now all year long, and then we've tested this hypothesis in our survey. But what happens is some of the sales cycles get longer, some purchase decisions get driven out, and some people would have bought in Q2 and wind up buying in Q3 or Q4, and they spend the same amount of money. So no change there from an annual perspective. But if you were going to buy in Q4 and wound up buying in calendar Q1 of the next year, well, that revenue just left one year and it went into the next year because of the delay in purchasing. Then what happens in year 2, presuming the recession essentially comes to an end and you get your normal sales cycles back, the sales cycles come back in, you get a year with extra revenue in it because you have some sales that were essentially last year's sales that got deferred into this year, plus you capture this year's sales. And this is because HPC is something that has a long sales cycle, something like major system purchases. It's not like what we're getting is the same customer purchasing systems every year. The major system purchases tend to happen in, every 3 or 4 year periods, but then someone who buys one this year doesn't buy one the next year or the year after that. So the major purchases are different organizations in different years, although it looks pretty stable. So you get in year 2, the people who would have bought that year plus some of the people who would have bought in the previous year, and it gives you a relative bump above the line that you would have had otherwise. And then if you look at that blue bracket that says artificially high growth, you wind up with what looks like this absurdly high growth rate from year 1 into year 2, but that's in some sense an optical illusion, because if you shoveled back some of the year 2 purchases into year 1 where they belonged and smoothed it out, it's not really that dramatic growth rate. Then in year 3 and 4, we project that you still see a little bit of a wiggle, and that's because of that exact dynamic I was just saying, that maybe someone who would have bought every other year, they have a push. So since I bought in year 2 instead of year 1, now I buy in year 4 instead of year 3, and so on. But because everybody's on different purchase cycles, that starts to smooth out. And by year 5, you're essentially back to the same growth path that you would have been on before. So if you look at the compound annual growth rate, which is based on where you start in year 0 and where you wind up in year 5, there's no effect on the compound annual growth rate. That's the same. But in the near term, you have a dramatic variability as it wiggles up and down. Now, look at that one box there, the lost revenue. The dips in year 1 and 3 are lower than the peaks are in years 2 and 4, which is to say, not everything that's delayed from year 1 is a delay. Some of them are cancellations. I was going to buy this, now I don't. The purchase is off. And that does happen to a certain extent. That's the true lost revenue. And we do see some of that, and that's in the shape of this curve. We actually have seen this before. This is not purely theoretical. These are the actuals of what we saw in the HPC market in the 2009 recession. 2009 was the last time we saw a year-over-year dip from 2000 from one year to the next. 2008 to 2009 was a drop. Then we had that what looked like a huge boom from 2009 to 2010, but it was really due to the effect that I described on the previous slide. And you can see that there's a little bit of that same wiggle in 2011, 2012, and by 2013 we essentially got back onto the path that we would have expected from 2008. Now there's some other things that go on that make any year odd. I loved the point yesterday about the difference between climate and weather, and climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. And forecasting is essentially somewhat like that. You forecast, the forecasts are smooth and actuals are bumpy according to what people actually buy. And that's a bit of an analogy from the weather side, but is really what we've seen. So that's what the market did from 2008 to 2013, and we expect to see that same kind of model again from 2019 to 2024. As we forecast the effect of COVID-19, we followed a multi-step process. We completed the forecast as we normally would have, using all of the data from pre-pandemic, because remember, we already had the budget data in the jar from the first part of the year. That survey ran in February, and then we didn't really hit the pandemic starting until March. We did issue very quickly a follow-up forecast about survey question about whether people were seeing any kind of effect from COVID, and we did get some data on that. But then our primary model looked at vertical markets. And that was because we expected to see a very different effect in, say, pharmaceuticals from what we would see in, say, auto manufacturing or oil and gas. These are all major vertical markets, and we expected to see a very different effect on those industries from COVID-19. So that was our primary consideration. But anytime we do something really new or different, we try to do it a couple different ways and then see if the different models can synthesize into something consistent. So we had secondary multi-year models by product segment, by regions, and other subcategories to make sure they were going to be consistent between the models and rectify those totals to the vertical market analysis. We looked at the total loss or gain over or below the previous forecast. We were essentially doing a delta model and then translating that into a revised forecast. So that was the pre-announce that we did in March, and then we did that put out the methodology. Then in July, we released the actual formal adjustment. The worldwide market would be 10% below what we had previously forecast for 2020. That does not mean a 10% drop from 2019 to 2020, because we had been forecasting growth, right? So now you wipe out all the growth, you're $4.2 billion below what we had forecast, and we get a 3.7% decline year over year, which isn't a huge decline. But the big thing that happens is it zaps out that growth, which is kind of what we saw here. This isn't a huge drop from 2008 to 2009, but it does wipe out that growth, so it looks more dramatic. So that's the first year of decline since then. Most of that revenue, like I said, is delayed, not lost, so we expect expect 2021 to be a rebound year, and that'll be 8% above the previous forecast, recapturing a lot of that 10% shortfall from the year before. Most of it comes back. Then we get a little bit of that wiggle in 2022, 2023, a little bit below the baseline, a little bit above the baseline before the return to normal in 2024. So the 5-year compound annual growth rate stays at 7.1%, but with major adjustments to the segments in the near-term years in between that. Now that translates to over $1 billion, $1.2 billion in actual revenue loss over the 5-year forecast, mostly from 2020 being further below the line than 2021 is above the line, although there is a little extra contribution from 2022 versus 2023. And then have to really underline the significant forecast risk in this, which is asking the question, how long do we deal with COVID-19 as an economic damper? Not to say that COVID-19 has to be eradicated or that everyone has to be vaccinated, but how long do we see the continued economic effects in the different vertical markets? We're at a point now where if the economy starts returning to normal, and by the end of the year, we're really back to a more normal economy, then we'd be pretty close to what we had forecast here. But if we go really, I would say beyond mid-year with significant economic effects in certain vertical markets, we're going to have to remodel those vertical markets based on an extended effect, an extended economic effect of COVID-19. And this is going to be significant work for Dan and me over the next, say, 2 months as we put together the revised forecast. So I said vertical markets for the primary area we were looking at. This is what that forecast looked like when we put it out in July. The biggest hit vertical markets in our model in 2020 with a rebound in 2021, energy. Energy is the oil and gas segment. That was already coping with a low price of oil prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic exacerbated it. There was famously that one future price on barrels of oils that temporarily went negative in the middle of the year. Now, that doesn't mean oil is really worthless. That was contracts for taking possession of oil at a specific place at a specific time, but did really highlight the severe economic effect that COVID-19 was having on the oil and gas market and continues to have on the oil and gas market as people are flying less, people are driving less. That all translates into that sector. Now, transportation, as was pointed out yesterday, has actually been up, particularly in cargo. So there has been somewhat of a mitigating factor. And this doesn't mean that there's no spending in oil and gas. It just means that we saw a bigger effect there than anywhere else. Retail, of course, has had a huge effect. When we look at retail in this case, mostly what we're seeing is the analytics for non-hyperscale retail. When you get into retail, meaning things like Amazon.com, that's been up. A lot of the online retail has been up, but mostly goes toward hyperscale as opposed to HPC. There is some analytics that can get into HPC there, but really this is a relatively small HPC segment. Your poster child here is like the analytics done by Walmart to support their inventory tracking and logistics. So we do see that as a vertical market for certain HPC. And then I mentioned large product manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, both have been hit pretty significantly. There's been some in entertainment as well. That's really worth noting. There have been a lot of delays in production of movies, things like that. Biosciences, we forecast to have a slight increase over the 2020 baseline, going the opposite direction from everything else, as we projected that projects would pull in relative to what we had previously expected in order to get resources to combat COVID-19. And that's something we've heard a great deal about. And in fact, we see that that's going to be even bigger than we had thought before. And then national labs, national research agencies, national security, we thought those public sector areas would be relatively stable next to everything else. Products and services, the thing that we would say is that while we expect the on-premises deployments to be constrained, cloud picks up the gap where on-premises get constrained. So if I push a purchase out for a new cluster, well, I can compensate by doing a little more cloud. So cloud has the opposite effect as everything else and actually had higher growth in the short term, although I'll stress that it's not affected in the 5-year compound annual growth rate, which was already high. It's just the near-term blips are over and above, so it gets there faster. And then finally, regions. When we had first put out our warning or our pre-announcement, we had thought that Asia Pacific would be the hardest hit and North America the least hard hit. By the time we released this in July, it was actually the other way around. North America, US, Canada having the biggest 2020 decline. Now, some insights from our HPC and AI technology survey, which Dan primarily presented in a webinar recently, and you can get, I'll show the link to where that is on our website. We did ask, has COVID-19 affected your HPC operations? This is a new survey now. So now looking back at 2020, 40% saying, yes, it affected my operations. 33% saying, yes, it affected my budget. So 1/3 of respondents said their budgets were affected by COVID-19. That's really in line with where we saw these things going. How has COVID-19 impacted your budget? So where there's been effect on the budget, certainly there's more down than up. A few people were reporting that it's up, but of the 33% that had an impact of the budget, 69% said it was down, 28% said it's up. So that's interesting data there. It certainly should be negative more than it's positive. Has it, how has it impacted your purchases? There's the percentage who are saying they've canceled, they've delayed, no change, they've accelerated, or they've created new project that was unplanned. So of the 33% that had an impact to their budget, there was 32%, so that's about 1 in 9, better than 1 in 10, that say there were new projects or unexpected spending that came from COVID-19. A lot of that's going to be in that scientific biosciences sector that we talked about. But 13% of 33% of respondents canceled HPC purchases. 43% of the 33% of respondents delayed HPC purchases. Again, really consistent with how we were modeling this. We have to translate this into actual numbers and model it according to size and industry sector, but we are building details from this data into our 2020 market model and 2021 to 25 forecast. Based on our newest data, this is the same chart as before. The chart hasn't changed. Very important you understand, we haven't changed this forecast yet. I just brought the same chart back up to say that based on the newest data, biosciences was probably even better than we had forecast it was, probably due to the length of the pandemic thus far. And for the same reason, academia probably worse than we had forecast. A lot of those cancellations coming from academia, and a lot of it coming from, by the time we got to the fall, September, October, a lot of things still not returning on campus, shutdowns that were hitting the fall terms in universities. And while most university spending is either grant funding or endowment funded, tuition isn't nothing, and universities started losing money from students not being on campus, and that has had an effect on HPC projects. Doesn't zero it out, but it means it's down, and it means that it's a little worse than we had forecast it was. But overall, this forecast is going to be, I think, in the right ballpark. We haven't seen a need to pre-announce any kind of significant deviation. So stand by from us and you'll see that very soon. I'm going to do a couple of quick hits from this same survey. We did survey liquid cooling in more detail than we had before. Found that liquid cooling is widespread in 16% of among sites responding, and that while door chillers are slightly the most common now, we are seeing an increase in fully plumbed facilities. People are starting to go that route more, and that will probably become the most common type of liquid cooling in the near term years. Cluster interconnects, InfiniBand still beating out Ethernet for the really high speeds, but Ethernet still taking about half of the market overall. This has been pretty consistent over the years, that it's been InfiniBand and Ethernet, and they just show up in different areas, with InfiniBand preferred for the higher speeds and Ethernet slightly preferred for the lower speeds. We have OmniPath on there because not dead. And with Cornelis Networks now coming out as a spin out from Intel, really want to see how much of a base they have to build on going forward. We also measured some of the high-end proprietary interconnects like Slingshot, Tofu, BXI, and we have data on those as well. CPU, GPU configurations. This really backed up what we measured in our 2020 HPC user rating survey, that what people really want the most is x86 CPUs with NVIDIA GPUs. But as we start getting Intel with its own accelerator, AMD with its own accelerator, and NVIDIA potentially with its own CPU with ARM, depending on the outcome of that acquisition, that might be not be the way that the market develops. So we were starting to look at how much do people like the different combinations of, say, Intel Xeon with their own Xe HPC accelerator, AMD, an all AMD environment, an all ARM plus NVIDIA environment. And that starts to become interesting data. And we really want to track what this looks like, say, in a year. As some of those products start coming to market. We looked at the resurgence of on-node storage, in particular with NVMEs and SSDs starting to get deployed more, and the different types of configurations of storage arrays. Flash and disk hybrids are becoming more common, although we still really see hard disk as the most common type of storage array due to the size of the data and the prevailing economics of storage. We continue to monitor parallel file systems, and GPFS and Lustre are still the most common. We were also looking at PANFS, Ceph, BGFS, Weka, and other types of solutions. But the big learning there is that we still don't see a lot of parallel file systems in the commercial sector for HPC outside of oil and gas, where they do tend to show up. And then public cloud usage, we've continued to monitor. This continues to show growth, but this is consistent with where we've seen it, that the majority of HPC users are making some usage of public cloud, but it tends to be an overall very small part of their workloads. It is growing. This is consistent with where it's been, although, well, I say consistent. It's not like it is growth, but it's not like a total hockey stick that's discontinuous from where it's been before. We continue to monitor the growth, and we feel like we've got this in the right place in our forecast. For more from us, Intersect360.com on the presentations tab under free content, or Intersect360.com/presentations. You can see our full 2020 technology survey webinar with Dan giving most of that presentation, along with other previous free presentations with registration. Our HPC budget survey, our annual survey, is now in the field tracking budget trends, allocations, CapEx, OpEx, and the overlap between HPC and machine learning. So watch for us to have an updated forecast coming out in May, along with those budget results. Our CAGRs, we'll make a decision. I'm leaning toward continuing to use 2019 as the baseline for CAGRs in the new forecast. Normally you'd update it to the current year, but that'd create a misperception if you use an artificially low year as a baseline for a CAGR. So we're going to keep monitoring that. As I said, we'll update our methodology to get a complete picture of cloud. Sign up for our newsletters, listen to our podcasts, become a client. I think I'm a little over time, but I'll leave it up to the organizers as to whether I can take any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Addison. Great presentation as always, great overview of the market. We do have one question here for you. What do you think will be the effect in HPC sales of the compression of Intel Xeon product cycles due to the manufacturing problems they've had in the 10 nanometer and 7 nanometer process?
What will be the effect on HPC purchase cycles?
Correct.
There's always the concern in purchase cycles of people waiting for the new processor. So when you have a longer development cycle of processors, then right before a new processor comes out, you can see a lengthening of sales as you get some people who want to wait for the new processor. But there are two factors going against that in this case. One is theoretically, you have a sped up development cycle, which means there's less to gain for waiting, right? If there's always something new, then in a sense, it doesn't matter when you buy it. There's always another new one coming. So that effect should diminish it. And then beyond that, there are more processor options now than there have ever been before. What's the primary motivator? Is it an Intel x86 processor? Are you also looking at AMD x86 processors? Are you also looking at ARM processors? Are you more motivated by a GPU or some other accelerator? And what the or an FPGA or something like that? And what's the development cycle there? So really, it's the diversity of processing elements here has a mitigating effect on that. From earlier in the cluster days when everything was homogeneous and everyone had the same cluster, well, that differentiation step up to the new Intel, that was the only thing there was. So of course people would wait for it, or maybe the new interconnect. But now there's so many different things you could be looking at. I just think that overall that diminishes the I'm going to wait for the next thing effect.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. Gilad, do you happen to have a question on your end? I see you're there in the panel.
Actually, I'm sorry, Gilad. This is Dan Olds. I just wanted to say that one of the questions that popped up in the chat was, is this a worldwide survey? It is, but the bulk of the participants were in North America. But that's something you'll see in the slide deck that we have up online.
Right. We get the majority from North America, which happens because, first of all, that's where most HPC spending is. It's about half in North America. And then also the effect is we don't translate the survey. So we return heavier from English speaking areas than we do otherwise. When we do our modeling, we do take a look at, we rebalance the surveys by geography or by sector, by large versus small, things like that in order to do modeling. And we get enough from Asia Pacific, Latin America, et cetera, that I'm confident in our ability to extrapolate those. In fact, in the most recent survey, I was quite pleased with Latin America, which returned at a higher rate than their proportion of revenue worldwide. And Dan Olds, everybody, take a bow, Dan. Welcome to the team.
The next question here was, do you think ARM CPUs will be successful in HPC?
I think ARM CPUs are already successful in HPC. Has anyone seen the Fugaku system?
Right.
That doesn't define success. Maybe by successful, the person asking the question has some threshold market share in mind, and that just takes time to develop. But I think the pendulum has certainly swung toward an era where there is more choice among processing elements, and that just brings about more trial. We are seeing a lot of ARM deployments, mostly early stage deployments, not really widespread deployments in HPC. But if you go to the full webinar, there's some data on that that Dan presents.
Okay. That was the last question. I didn't know if Gilad was piping up there or not, but I'll ask you this, Addison. What's your prediction as an analyst? Is SC21 going to be live in person or fully virtual?
If I had to make my living as an analyst projecting what would or would not be canceled by the pandemic, I would have been out of a job by now. I have done a poor job of. I will say that the challenge is not just what the world looks like in November, but what the world looks like in the near term months, like right now and next month. Because if you're going to have an in-person conference, you have to have the sponsors lined up, and you have to get your sponsors committed with contracts and booth space and hotels and how many people are you going to send. So the fuse is already going on, what's the deadline for making those kinds of decisions. It could be that you can't get that pulled off in time and you have to go to a virtual conference. And by November, everyone's saying, why weren't we in St. Louis, right? We feel fine now. So it's a question of how early people can commit that's going to drive that discussion, I think.
Well, thank you, Addison.